He keeps himself in trim by bending bars of iron. This bar is the genuine article which we tested before he began to play with it.
Beyond the bend, beyond the bend.
All right. Everybody, we have a very special guest tonight. We have Mr. Mark Hewitt in the house. Welcome to Beyond the Bend, Mark.
Hey, good to be here. Thanks for having me. I always appreciate a chance to talk a little bit about catch as catch can and the history of the sport.
So this is a little bit different of one. Usually we have some steel benders on and different types of grip athletes and everything. But in my mind, it's all related. And in my personal experience as a grappler that through COVID sought out grip strength and found steel bending, it ultimately is connected. So it was personally, I wanted to have you on because I was fascinated by your episode with Jake Shannon. And I know a good majority of our listeners are jiu-jitsu guys, wrestlers, and grapplers of all kinds. So people will really like this one. So why don't you tell me a little bit about your history and how you became to have such a love for catch wrestling?
Yeah, I grew up in the 1960s in Maryland, not too far from Washington, D.C. Became a fan, I don't even remember how old I was, very young, of the professional wrestling on TV. I never, ever wrestled or played sports officially, but I was always an enthusiast. I'd get the neighborhood kids together and we try to imitate what we saw the pros do. Always loved combat sports. My parents were big boxing fans, so I was exposed. There was some great boxing in that time period. Muhammad Ali and everybody. I grew up seeing some really good heavyweight boxing. But I was always fascinated by wrestling, and there just wasn't a lot of history written about it. And I wanted to know, where did this come from? You know, this is different. I can see there's a lot of showbiz here, but I think some of these guys really know what they're doing and are really lethal, martial artists. So I began a search, to really try to uncover the history of the sport and where it came from and how it came to be. So I kind of got away from it in my teenage years, but after I got married and had kids, my son was a Hulkamaniac that had been in the early 80s. So I kind of started taking him to the matches, and I got interested again, said, I want to figure out, what is this? Very little books written about it at the time. So I tried to find as many old timers as I could, interviewed them, picked their brains, tried to find out what was behind what they were doing, and I found that there was catch as catch can wrestling, ancient lineage, old history. It was legitimate. These guys, some of these guys, when they really had to, could take care of themselves, without any trouble. And so I wanted to learn more about it. So I started researching that and going back and spent a lot of time in newspaper archive, going through newspaper microwaves, microfilms, and going back and just gathering information about guys like Farmer Burns and Frank Gotch, of course, Tom Jenkins, John Pesic, Strangle Lewis, George Bothner, Ad Santel. And then I began to see that there was a melding that happened in North America, where you had the old Lancaster style catch as catch can, which actually was brought to Britain from a Germanic background, the Flemish, Flanders and Swiss. Because the traditional English folk wrestling and a lot of traditional wrestling is stand up, where two guys come to a grip and you try to throw one another to the ground, and that is a fall that ends the match, or that ends that fall. But in catch as catch can, they actually got on the ground and rolled around, and the British considered it undignified, and they called it like a dog fight. So they looked down on it. So it kind of had a rough and ready reputation, but it really caught on when it was brought to North America, and it kind of blended here. Leave it to us Americans to take something like that and make it our own. And they just some rough and tumble fighting. Borrowed some from Japanese jiu-jitsu and judo when some of those experts first started touring the Western world. It all kind of blended together into a professional sport, but based on legitimate, holds and grappling and ability to defend yourself. and and take out anyone. So anyways, that's kind of it in a nutshell. So I spent years and years, just trying to put this story together. I've written a couple books about it. It's just, I still am fascinated by it today. And it's probably been close to 45, 50 years of doing this research because you find new stuff out all the time.
I love it.
But, in hand, go ahead.
I love it. And it's just like, it's such a rich history, and I've only, really just started to tap into it. And I love the idea that maybe the layman, the grappler that maybe just thought submission fighting really kicked off post UFC 1. We're talking about a rich history here in the United States of submission fighting. We're talking Kimuras and all of these moves that most people just associate with Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. And that was my experience up until listening to you and finding out about Farmer Burns and these guys. And it's just so fascinating to me that, like, especially in the era that a lot of the listener, the steel benders and the old time strongmen, we're talking turn of the century, we've got the catch people, the performing strongmen. That just sounds like such a unique time.
Right. Okay.
So if you could,
I lost you for a minute. Are we still there?
Yep, we're good.
Okay.
What I'd like to know is, where did the work kind of start to take priority over the actual realistic fight? What years are we talking where the work kind of took over?
Yeah, I tell you, you'll get different opinions on that. And I have 2 or 3 or more friends that I've been researching with and corresponding with for years. And none of us fully agree. My personal opinion is that professional wrestling has always been a big part of show business. It was the nature of the game. One time it was part of circuses, part of carnivals. You mentioned the old time strongmen. I mean, they were hand in hand, the wrestler and the strongman act. So I think and then there used to be betting was a big part of it. And, it wasn't just, it was, side bets, wagers. So I think there was and you'd find this in boxing or even in old baseball, any kind of sport activity where betting is really a big part of it. There's going to be, it's questionable whether it's always legitimate, whether there was some kind of prearrangement, but professional wrestling per se has always largely been a good percent showbiz. But the difference between back then and today is those guys could really go. I mean, when they had to, when money was really on the line, they knew how to really wrestle. They knew how to take a man out quick. They knew how to make them give up. That kind of got lost over the years, that ability, that old time catch as catch can. And there were legitimate, contests, 100% bona fide, I would say, into the early 1930s. Okay. Especially among the lighter weight, the middleweights and the lightweights and the welterweights. They had a high caliber of the ability to shoot, and they wanted to shoot. So that's my take on it. You talk to another researcher or historian, he might say it's always been completely fixed. Another one, some people like to say, well, it was real up until the 50s or 60s, but anyways, I try to be honest about it, just evaluate it. And when you see somebody like Frank Gotch wrestling the same guy over and over and over again, city after city, it's a show. And I have the highest part for Frank Gotch. I'm not knocking. But you can kind of see between the lines, okay, well, if they're all traveling together and putting on shows, they're putting on a show. That doesn't mean that, part of the show would usually be they throw a challenge out to the crowd and anybody could come and take them on and be given a cash prize if he could last a certain amount of time without being thrown. And then different towns would have their own local pride, their champion, so they could draw a big crowd. I mean, that was the bottom line. They were trying to make a living. So they wanted to draw a crowd. So if they could wrestle to a draw or wrestle to some kind of crazy finish that was controversial, then they could have a rematch, draw another big crowd. So it's always been connected like that. So that, I think that there's always been a strong element of working, but they could shoot. And that got lost over the decades. That got lost by the 50s and 60s, and certainly today. The idea now, until the revival, grappling submission style wrestling revived following the UFCs and the Gracies, back to it. But that old knowledge was kind of lost. And that's, I was really pleased to be able to seek out and interview and get to know some of those old timers who actually had some background in that shooting and knew what was going on. I've considered that a great experience to have met some of these guys like Ron Hess and Dick Cardinal, Billy Wicks, Red Bastine, all come to mind, and just they shared with me growing up. And all those guys traveled with the carnival athletic shows where they would take on all comers as part of the carnival show. Anybody could step up and challenge, say, I want to wrestle this guy. So they had to know something. And that's what they learned. They learned how to end a match quick, with an arm lock or a foot lock or something. And they learned that, Billy or Red Bastine, all those guys are deceased now. But the Red Bastine told me once that he never worried about getting in a bar fight, going into bars, because he said he knew that there wouldn't be any effort. He could have this guy on the floor screaming or break his arm like that. So he said he'd just walk away. It meant nothing to him. Now, so anyways, that kind of put something in me. I thought, there's something to that. I really want to help preserve this knowledge. So
definitely.
Anyways,
I studied.
Go ahead.
I studied a little bit of Billy Wicks. Once I heard your interview on Scientific Wrestling, I started searching YouTube for just Carney style wrestling. I just wanted to see what would come up. And sure enough, a Billy Wicks video came up. He was explaining the front headlock and how to make it extra painful with the cutting bone and on your wrist there. And
right.
That's a specialty of mine, the guillotine or the front headlock. So I took some little tidbits from that. And Billy Wicks is still living, correct?
No, all those guys have passed away that I named. Billy Wicks, the last one, Dick Cardinal, just passed away like around the day before Christmas, right around Christmas. Billy Wicks is dead for a few years. Now, he has several of his students are pretty prolific. John Strickland, Johnny Buck. They still are carrying on, and I think they're teaching and coaching, and they have videos. And I think you can. I think John Strickland calls his American Hook Wrestling. You can find that, and I can send you links. If anything you're interested in. But unfortunately, that generation is pretty much all passed on. Dick Cardinal might have been the last one actually took on all comers as a traveling catch can wrestler on the carnival shows that I'm aware of. Frankie Kane is still alive, and there's one Frankie Kane. There's a real good first volume of a biography that Scott Teal put together that's available on the Crowbar Press right now. It's a good story, and he talked about learning from some of these old timers and growing up and how it came about.
I might have the name wrong. I'll figure it out who it is and send it to you. I'll send you the video I watched on YouTube.
Cool. Well, his videos are there, so it might have been him, Billy Wicks. He was in North Carolina, is where he finished out his days in western part of North Carolina in the mountains there. I think Hendersonville, North Carolina. Okay. And something you said on Jake's podcast, you mentioned that sometimes the two grapplers would fight to figure out who was going to be the winner in the show. I thought that was a really interesting aspect to kind of the turning of the legit match into the work. Right. Yeah, to determine who was the toughest guy, they would test one another and they'd agree. One of the Ed Strangler Lewis and his manager, Billy Sandow, were a really powerful force in the history of professional wrestling in the 20s and 30s, even earlier. And Strangler Lewis was a very capable, very strong grappler. Billy Sandow was a wizard, but he was more running the show, promoting it. So they keep a stable of guys, and they used to keep what they'd call a policeman. And that was a guy who, if somebody was challenging Ed Stringer Lewis as a champion and they didn't know what he was about, they'd say, well, you have to get through this guy first. So they used John Pesic, the guy they called the Nebraska Tiger Man. He, in my opinion, was probably the toughest catch-can wrestler that ever lived. But they used him. They kept him on salary, on contract as a policeman. So you had to get through him to get to the champion. And they also had another very tough guy in their camp, Joe Toots Mont. And they were both almost equal, but they got arguing among themselves as which one was tougher. So they decided to settle it out. They met in a gym. It wasn't for money, and they might have made a side bet. I don't know. But they got into it in the gym. I believe they probably did a little more rough and tumble than just plain wrestling. But Pesic walked away in the winter. And Billy Sandell got really pissed off about it because here are two of his guys that were fighting among themselves. So he got into it with Pesic, and Pesic walked away, and he became a troublemaker for the promoters, because after that. But anyway, so there was a lot of that kind of thing. That's what you mentioned, where they tested one another, and there was a lot. They were proud of what they knew, so they're okay. Show me, make me give up, make me beat me.
Yeah, I really love that aspect, and that wasn't something I knew until I heard your other interview. The other thing I really, really loved from Jake's interview was when you were talking about the canal workers and the riverboat men that would
yeah,
and they'd had the red feather, and the toughest guy wore the red feather. That I just love that. And I have a friend that works on boats going up and down the Hudson River from the city up to Albany and Canada sometimes, and he got a big kick out of just the rivermen being extra tough and all that. I like that.
Right.
Could you explain that a little bit?
That's a cool story and a cool part. Yeah, well, in early American history, the rivers, the waterways were the main arteries for commerce, for travel. A lot of the countryside was wilderness, and there were dangers in the wilderness, but you could get up, and they'd move, the products, produce up and down the rivers. And so the guys that worked on these riverboats gained a reputation as being, the toughest guys around. And every boat, every keel boat or barge boat had its own champion, the toughest guy. And he would wear a red feather in his hat. And it was like a standing challenge to anybody that saw that red feather. If they wanted, they'd say, okay, let's see how tough you are. And they weren't professionals. They'd work all day, back-breaking, excruciating work. They'd pull these boats from the land with cables up one way, and they'd be able to float down the other way. So they were working like mules. And then for entertainment, they beat the daylights out of one another. But every town along the river had their own tough guy too. It was a thing in popular culture. The toughest guy in the town. They called it a bully. The word bully comes from the French word bourgeois, or he'd be like the foreman of the crew. So that somehow that got named bully. So every town had a bully. Every boat had a bully. So if you were a particularly tough and sure of yourself town bully, you'd walk down to the bank, and as the boats rolled by, you'd yell out, cuss them, challenge them, throw your hat in the air, try to get them to land so a match could be arranged between you and the boat bully. So this would have been 1800s, into the first few decades of the 1800s, when that was the thing. Mike Fink, the folklore hero, was actually a real guy. Mike Fink was one of the toughest of the boatmen, the old time boatmen. And he became a folk hero. There's a lot of folk tales about him, but cool stories, great history. A lot of it kind of gets passed over because it's unofficial. So you see glimpses of it just reading through old history books and things. So I tried to put some of that together to make it a cohesive story. And you see a tradition developing there. That professional wrestling was kind of stemmed from some of this stuff that that there were these traveling guys who were willing to wrestle, all out fight, rough and tumble. They just wanted to use their fists and try and put some regulations on it. And, however they wanted to fight, they would fight. And the big impetus was not only on earning your reputation, but money would be wagered on it. And, you'd bet your money. You'd have backers that would put their money down. Townspeople would come and support you. And so all that kind of lends itself to the fixing a little bit, because when there's a lot of money involved, it's not too far till somebody's going to say, okay, we can make even more if you beat me and I beat you next week or next trip up and down. We switch. So that's, and again, none of that takes away from the legitimacy and the toughness of these guys. I have the highest respect. I wish we had a time machine. We could go back and watch some of this stuff in person. Fascinating.
Now, the same thing was kind of happening in England, correct? I think I saw in the whole Not Taken documentary that these were like mine workers, right? And it was like after their shift at the mine, they'd sometime wrestle. So it's hard manual labor, and the outlet was the grappling, correct?
Yeah, exactly. And that was the Lancashire district of England, is where catch as catch can wrestling really took birth. It kind of was brought to that area from Lancashire was a textiles. It was coal mines, but it was also a textile center. So in Flanders, the Flemish weavers started migrating to that part of England to work in the textile industry. And they brought with them their love for what they called up and down fighting, which was stand up fighting, go to the ground, grapple, headbutt, kick, whatever, anything goes, what we'd call no holds barred today. They called it up and down fighting. So, and that really took on in that part of England, whereas the rest of England, they were doing, like I said, the stand up wrestling, sort of like collar and elbow, where you lock up in a grip and you maneuver, try to outpower the other guy and trip them or make them go to the ground. Whereas what was developing in Lancashire was you wouldn't take an initial hold. That's catch as catch can. You'd grab his arm, you'd grab his body, you'd grab his head, whatever you could catch hold of. If you ended up on the ground, you could stay on the ground. You try to either not just throw the guy to the ground, but you had to pin him. You had to hold him down, or some kind of lock or hold that made him give up and cry enough. So that's what developed there. And that's, that was those were the guys came from. They brought it to America. Lancashire wrestlers like Tom Connors and Joe Acton and Edwin Bibby in the late 19th century. And Farmer Burns, although he never acknowledged it, learned from Tom Connors. He traveled around with Tom Connors and learned that old Lancashire wrestling. And of course, he added his own, American nuance to it, and rough and tumble. And I think they borrowed a little bit from the Japanese and kind of blended it all together. That's kind of the development of professional wrestling and what Farmer Burns taught and what he taught Frank Gotch. Frank Gotch becoming, the great first world champion, American world champion, catch as catch can wrestler, So great roots in England, roots definitely in England, roots in Germanic culture as well. The Germans had what they called the Turner Society, Germanic gymnastic societies. And a lot of German immigrants ended up in North America and also in England as well. And they also had this tradition of this loose wrestling or freestyle wrestling. So they brought that, and a lot of the best wrestlers in early North America were German or of German background. So there's a strong, that kind of sometimes overlooked. Yeah. Frank Gotch was German. George Botham, Rad Santel, Charles Olson, despite his Swedish sounding name, was German. They were some very, very tough wrestlers, and they kind of a lot of them were based in New York, around New York City. Some of them made it out to Chicago, but some very, very tough. So there's a blending, and not just going back to Wigan and Lancashire. There was a strong Germanic influence. and it all kind of came together. I'm not taking anything away from any of them, from Wigan or the Snake Pit or Lancaster. I'm giving them full acknowledgement, but there was also a very strong influence from the Germanic culture. They love their ground wrestling and their loose wrestling, and they a lot of it was military training, so they were more brutal. It was became really a martial art. How to break an arm or choke a man out or whatever the case may be.
Any Russian influence in there? Because I know obviously in more modern times the Sambo is a very, very good system.
Right. I think maybe, and I don't know this because I've never really studied it out, but I think that was a little reverse, is that when Sambo was developed, they sought out all these other styles and amalgamated it. Now, the Russians were great they had some great professional Greco-Roman wrestlers. Yeah. Which isn't quite the same as catch-as-catch-can. You can't take holds below the legs, below the waist. I mean, so it's a little different, related, similar, certainly connections back and forth. But I don't know if there's a strong Russian catch-as-catch-can or ground wrestling tradition. Now, Turkey had one. There's Turkish wrestlers fit right in. Found a home in early professional wrestling because they had their own traditions along those lines.
And how about where does Brazil play a role in this at all? Do you think anything traveled down from North America to the Brazilians? Because they're in jiu-jitsu, I'm sure you're somewhat familiar, is the feud between the Gracies and the Luta Livre guys, which were basically catch wrestlers that didn't fight in the gi and did a lot of leg locks. And there was almost gang wars in the early 90s between these two styles. And was there any North American influence going down to Brazil, do you believe?
I think there had to be. Maeda himself, before he ever made it to Brazil, traveled around North America and Europe and competed as a catch-as-catch-can wrestler. So now, he was a Kodokan judoka, so he had that legitimate official background right from Japan. He traveled all over the United States. He traveled all over Europe and competed in catch-as-catch-can tournaments. So he knew catch-as-catch-can. He went through Mexico and Cuba. He was real popular in Cuba, but he ended up in Brazil, taught competed there again as a wrestler, but really more teaching, and left that legacy that was picked up by, of course, the Gracies and all the exponents of, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So there was an influence, and I don't know, there was another guy, one of Carlos's Gracie's opponents, Manuel, I can't think of his name. No, not him. Not Ivan Gomez. This was way back. Okay. One of Carlos Gracie, the oldest Gracie brothers, early opponents. So we're talking 1930, 1929, 1930, had come to America and learned catch-as-catch-can wrestling. Rufino. So there was, and it took off. The Brazilians loved it, and there was a real back and forth. Like one card in Rio de Janeiro or Sao Paulo, say in the 1930s, might have some professional wrestling. You might have a no holds barred luta livre. You might have a jiu-jitsu rules match, and you might have a couple of boxing matches, all as part of one show. So there's a real blending, and and we find that nobody has it all. It belongs to everybody. No one culture has it all down. This is ours. Right. Whether the Kimura, wrist lock, you call it this, you call it that. It's the same thing, and it goes way back. You look at those hieroglyphics in ancient Egypt. I mean, they're doing wrestling holds, submission holds, and whatnot. So, I wish I knew more about Brazil. Lately, there has been a little more serious research. Not being able to read Portuguese, I've gone through some Brazilian newspapers, but it really doesn't mean too much to me. Trying to figure out. But I see that there was definitely some North American catch-as-catch-can experience that made its way into Brazil and to Argentina as well. and established a base. And the one Gracie brother, we all know of Helio, the older brother Carlos, but one of the younger brothers, George Gracie, was probably the toughest of them all. And he fought anybody any kind of way. He didn't care what kind of rules. He'd Vale Tudo, Jiu-Jitsu, Luta Livre. He'd appear when the pro wrestlers were poor. He'd appear on their cards. And the other brothers he fell out of favor with the rest of the family. But from what I can understand, he might have been the most prolific of the Gracie brothers when it came to fighting and putting it on the line.
Yep. That sounds a lot like the late Rolls Gracie or Holes Gracie.
Right.
That was the next generation Hickson's brother who's passed. There's stories of him training with college wrestlers, and he would fight sambo. He'd fight anything, very similar to the stories of George.
Right.
You said something funny there about moves being around for generations and generations. I recently heard that there's evidence of almost every grappling move tracing back hundreds and hundreds of years, except for the triangle choke with the legs. And then John Danaher said he didn't see anything from that until post 1900s, maybe even later 1940s or something like that. He had never seen anyone strangle a man or a person with their legs with the one arm in. You know what I'm talking about, like triangle choke from guard.
Right.
To his knowledge, there is no historical evidence prior to that. Like, everybody's seen the Greek statues of like a heel hook with the guy with cauliflower ears. But supposedly there's no triangle choke with the legs prior to 1900 or so.
I'm not aware of any. I'm going to look into that. That sounds interesting. Yeah, I know the old sculptor of the heel hook with the centaur putting the heel hook on a guy. Have you seen that? The old sculptor going back to, I guess, ancient Greek. And there's in Burma, there's some temple site where there's a perfect rear naked choke.
Oh, cool.
A guy putting a rear choke on another guy, a sculptor. But that, there's, I guess, new things do come up from time to time. But,
I mean,
and that was a big part of catch as catch can, was using the legs.
Yep.
Some of the best components of it, they would say, was like wrestling a guy with two sets of arms. He could use his leg like I use my arms. Or the one Clarence Eklund, they called him the centipede. And somebody said it was like wrestling a guy with 10 arms, because they could just use their legs. They could put a Phil Nelson on you with their legs.
Yeah,
crazy like that. Leg wrestling is a big part of the traditional catch as catch can.
Definitely. One parallel that I find pretty interesting with the catch stuff compared to the old time strongman stuff is the evidence of the work, right? So we in the steel bending community, obviously everybody's way into the Mighty Atom, and their mind was blown when they read about Joseph Greenstein. And he's obviously an incredible person, but he was padding his age. He was adding 10 years to his age anytime he did stuff. And there's other things here and there. And it's like you said, anytime there's money to be made or had or bet or anything, that's when like a little bit of trickiness comes in. So I like that parallel between the grappling and the old time performing strongman.
Right. Yeah. Mighty Atom. Yeah. Incredible guy. That book about him, that was like, that blew my mind. I read that years and years ago. I don't know if it's still available or not, but what an incredible human being. This little short guy just who could hold off airplanes from taking off with his hair. I mean, what power he was able to generate. And one thing that this might mean something to you, John Pesek, I never did meet. He was already passed away by the time but I did get to know several of his children, particularly one of his daughters, Mary Lee, a grandson, Jeff. But they said he always said his greatest power came from his abdomen. And I immediately thought of like the Asian concept of chi, being based. And somehow he, without knowing anything about any of that, his center of power was he felt was in his abdomen, where he generated his strength and power. Now, he had some really unusual training regimens that he did himself, and maybe you and your listeners might be interested in hearing this. Now, he grew up on a farm, so sun up to sundown, hard work, and then they'd wrestle for fun when the farming was done. But he always kept an old car around his ranch, and he would go out in the field and he'd push and pull the old car around. And then he'd have a little section of tall fence, and he'd have a big pile of heavy rocks on one side. He called it his daily dozen. And he'd go out there and hoist up one of the stones, manhandle it over the top of the fence, get them all over there. The next day he'd go back and throw them on the other side. And that got him used to gripping and holding, heavy and lifting it up, and maneuvering it. So he did crazy things like that. He did the traditional workouts with weights and pulleys and things, but he had developed a lot of his own training techniques. And I think you find that, that what worked for him, he would hang himself by his neck. Let's see. I don't know if.
Yep, I got it.
Can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay, that's him. He holding the weight cling to his chest, and he just holding himself up with a cable around his neck, because having a powerful neck was really important, to their trade, to what they did. So, and then Farmer Burns, his boast was that he couldn't be strangled if he flexed his neck muscles, because that's how strong he developed. And they do it through practicing bridging and crazy things like Pesic's doing there, hanging himself.
Yeah.
So, but they just did whatever worked. And there's something to be said for that hard work, being outside. They really believed in training outdoors, breathing in the air. Some of the guys really pushed clean living. Not all of them did. Farmer Burns was he didn't drink, he didn't smoke, he didn't cuss. He really believed in leading a full, clean, healthy life. Now, that wasn't all around. Many of them did indulge and enjoyed it, but they really took their serious and worked out and trained. And you see it in a lot of these old photographs. I mean, these guys were in shape. Now, here's a picture of Pesic, probably from 1920. They took it seriously. Farmer Burns, they stayed healthy a long time. Now, George Boffner, another of the great old wrestlers, smoked cigars regularly, enjoyed drinking. It didn't bother him. So they're different, whatever works for different ones. But some of that, there was you're familiar with the term physical culture. They believed in physical culture, that the body was like a temple, or like a gift from God, and it was up to you to take care of yourself and and not abuse yourself. So different strokes for different folks, but it's interesting to see their mindset and how they went about it.
Oh, definitely.
So you're into bending spikes and things. Would that fall into what you're talking about?
Yep. So there's all different lengths of stuff and all different diameters. A lot of these guys are really into like a 7-inch by 5/16 piece, and you get it under your chin and you bend it over like that, try to touch your fists together. That's double overhands, unbraced style bending. But then there's other guys that are bending crescent wrenches in half, and long bar, something like 48 inches down to like 36, and then doing the horseshoes too. So for me, it was like it felt very similar to the type of strength I need for grappling, and I wanted to develop for grappling, like the real tendon strength, building your tendons and your ligaments different from the belly of the muscle, so I felt like my hands getting much stronger from manipulating this metal, and I just got really into it. And there wasn't a podcast about it, and that's how I ingest my information about my hobbies. So I started the podcast about it. So
I lost you for a minute.
Oh, that's okay. I was saying that there wasn't a steel bending podcast, so I started the steel bending podcast.
Okay. Okay. I have a really good friend of mine. He's out in California now. His name's Richard Army McGuire. We call him Army McGuire. But he's been into that for a long time. He's an old circus guy. He was an elephant trainer. But
Really?
now he manufactures and Indian clubs and sells Indian clubs.
Okay.
And does dog training for people. But he's the first guy that he really got into grip strength, hand strength, and bending and breaking coconuts, breaking cinder blocks. But I'll put you in touch with him because he's been doing it for a long time.
Great.
He whoever the Mighty Adams protege was,
Slim Farman. Yeah, Slim Farman.
Yeah, he went up and met him, talked with him. But he used to like to do all that stuff. We'd be out. He'd have some spikes in his pocket. He'd wrap them up in a bandana or cloth. He'd bend them, and he talked about it he'd almost feel them get hot or something. It's been a while since he's explained it to me. It'd feel right when they were ready to go. And he I don't remember him doing them up. He'd usually take them low. It's been a long time, but he's a real good friend. But he would be very knowledgeable, and he loves to talk about it.
Oh wow, that sounds great.
He made a study of strong. So he decided that he wanted to understand, and he's really into Oriental medicine too, because he rubs something into his hands to make them real tough. I don't know. Wow. But Army McGuire, I'll put you in touch with him because like he'd be right down your alley.
That'd be great. Yeah. So I had Sean Doherty on the show not long ago. He's part of Snake Pit along with Joel Bain. And are you familiar with Sean?
Okay. I know Joel Bain pretty well.
Yep.
Actually, him and my son graduated from Frederick High School in Frederick, Maryland, the same year.
Oh, okay.
I went to one of his catch wrestling events up in New Jersey, and I went to the recent one he just had near Baltimore. So Joel is a great guy. I have a lot of respect for what he's doing and the work he does. So, but Sean Doherty, is that one of the guys associated with him? The name sounds familiar. I don't know.
So Sean fought in UFC too, but that was before he knew any grappling, actually. And he later then went out west and was part of Lion's Den with Ken Shamrock. But then most importantly, after that, he found himself in Colorado training with John Saylor. Are you familiar with John at all?
Okay. Yeah. I know the name. Yeah. I don't know him personally, but I know who he is.
So he was I think the coach for the Olympic team for judo, and there's a story of him wrestling Rorion Gracie to a draw a number of times with a paralyzed right shoulder, and he started this thing called Shingi Tai Jiu-Jitsu, and it's sort of like an amalgamation of judo, jiu-jitsu, and catch, as we all know. But the reason I'm very fascinated with John, and I hope I get to speak to him, is he, since the mid 70s to 80s, was really going hard with the grip training stuff in combination with the grappling. That was a very big portion of his training, was developing the grip. And he had a man I met on Facebook just a little bit named Peter Ragnar that was a student of his, that they were bending metal and scrolling these crazy designs with the metal, all in just like my quest in an effort to improve grip strength for grappling. So I've been having a lot of fun researching that. You'd enjoy reading some of John's stuff as well.
Sure. Okay, I'll look that up. I'll look up some. Yeah, I know the name. Like I said, I don't know him personally, but I have heard the name. So yeah, there's a lot out there, and a lot of things are being rediscovered and new interest. Some of it's kind of niche. You have to find other people interested in the same stuff, but it is popular, and there's a good avenue, and it's great to see, somebody like yourself, helping to preserve it and learn it and pass it on and spread the word about it. So they do go hand in hand. What good is wrestling if you don't have a good strong grip? If you can't. And that was the thing. If they locked onto you with a powerful grip, you knew somebody had hold of you, and you couldn't get away so easily. So you can see the connection there, and how they go hand in hand. It's a great history, Cody. And I'm still fascinated with it after all these years, and still continuing to try and learn and write up some of these old stories so that they don't get forgotten. And passing it on, and just that's when with Joel Bain with his events, it's really invigorating to me to see, wow, this is years ago. I used to dream about, I wish I could really see some authentic catch wrestling taking place for legitimately. And it's good to see it. And of course, the UFC changed the world. The Gracies, Hoist Gracie, changed the martial arts world forever with what happened with the few UFCs, and you can see what's happening, and such an interest now. We see it all over, so it's really it's a good time to be, because we can look back and see the history of it, but you can see it ongoing and what's happening today and how it's being continued and carried on. So.
Oh, definitely. No, I think there will be. I think we're still on the uptick, the incline for interest in catch wrestling. So, as jiu-jitsu diverges, kind of between the players that still want to compete in the gi and the kimono, right, and the guys that don't want to compete in that. Like I primarily don't compete in the gi, and I enjoy my training more without the gi. So even some of the best jiu-jitsu coaches now are preaching the importance of pinning, not pinning in the sense of winning the match by pin, but, how do you control your opponent with no gi, so you can therefore transition to your submission. So I feel like if catch wrestling was a stock, it would definitely be time to buy in. I foresee many of the jiu-jitsu guys like myself will be continuing to research catch wrestling for sure.
Yeah, it's a great history. There's a lot to it, and again, it's not one style or one thing doesn't hold all the answers. That's why you got to keep open, and that's I really love catch as catch can, but I also enjoy reading about jiu-jitsu history, judo history. I really love digging into the old rough and tumble fighting, which wasn't really a sport so much, but basically we call that street fighting. It'd be the same as what we call today street fighting. But there's a history to that as well. Goes way back.
Yep.
They used to call them eye gougers.
Right.
That's the main tactic. You try and gouge out the other guy's eye. But even among those old time rough and tumble fighters, they had two rules: never gouge out the eye of a one-eyed man. Never mind. If you only had one eye left, don't go after its one good eye. And at any time during the fight, if he cracked off, you'd stop.
Oh, okay.
If you didn't give
Some
up,
honor.
you could keep. But he said, "All right, I've had it." Then you backed off. So those were the two rules of the old time rough and tumble fighters. Never gouge out the one good eye of one-eyed man, and let him go when he's had enough.
I like that.
So rules to live by, I guess.
Yeah. So before we get out of here, Mark, I know you've written a couple books. I just want to make sure that people know what those are called, and if they're able to be bought still, or.
Well, unfortunately, here's the first one, Catch Wrestling.
Catch Wrestling. Yep.
And the second one, Catch Wrestling Round 2.
Perfect.
And they were published by Paladin Press. Paladin Press went out of business, I don't know, 7 years ago. They couldn't compete with the ebooks, and they were such a niche market, but they just shut down. So they're no longer available. I have a few copies left, not many of my own. I'm looking into getting them republished myself. I own the rights to them. And I'm also working on a third book, which is tentatively titled Before MMA, or some of this background to what led to modern MMA, wrestlers versus boxers, things like that. And so that might be in the works. So you can find them and use book markets, eBay, Amazon.com, I guess, used books. I think sometimes they charge a lot for them, a lot more than I would ever pay for them. But some of the books, Amazon.com, it's kind of crazy, some of the prices they put down. But I wish if somebody can find them, a lot of effort and work has gone into them.
I'm going to track one down.
Well, I mean, I'd be happy to send you a copy of this one, the first one.
Okay.
Just, PM me your address, and because I have some of these left. The second book, I only have that one and maybe one other one.
Yeah.
So if I can get them back, people ask me all the time, so that's probably telling me I ought to get them back on the market.
Yeah, I think so.
I have that, and I write a lot of articles. You can find them online all the time. I'm putting out new articles. Really a big article I did a lot of research on was, to me, what was one of the greatest catch-as-catch-can matches that ever took place was in Boston in 1923 between John Pesek and the Olympic medalist Nat Pendleton, and it was 100% shoot, money on the line. But it's a fascinating bit of history right there. For catch-as-catch, we're probably two of the arguably best world-class catch-as-catch-can wrestlers of their day, deciding to go ahead and really wrestle it out in a public venue, not in private, but in a public venue, ticket buying venue, and putting up large amounts of money going to the winner take all. The loser didn't even get car fare home. So it was 100% the real deal. And so that's out there. Jake Shannon has some of those articles on his website. If Scientific Wrestling, I think you can find some of them there. But I like telling the story. To me, it's a story worth telling.
Oh, absolutely.
So,
all right, Mark. Well, that's it. I really appreciate you coming on, and I had a blast talking to you. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you for having me, Cody. Really good, and appreciate what you're doing. And anything I can ever do to help you, lend you a hand, give me a holler, and shoot me your address, and I'll get a book off to you.
Appreciate that. Thanks so much. I'll send you that stuff about the town where I grew up. I think you'd find it interesting.
I love history. I'm an old history buff all around. So sounds good.
All right. Have a good rest of the night.
All right.
Thanks, Mark.
Good night.